The Internet Protocol version 4, IPv4. So in networking, you want to look at it in a layered system. You have what you call the OSI model, which is a 7-layered system. Starting off from the 7th layer going down, you have the application, presentation, session, transport, network, data link, physical. IPv4 is dealing with layer 3. Layer 3 is dealing with networking addressing. It is a logical addressing. So at layer 3 is where you get the IP address, right? And as an example, I'll give you like 192.168.1.7, right? Now this is a private IP address. Private IP address meaning that it's non-routable. You know, you won't see this IP address outside of your network being routed. So if you're on your computer and you type in like ipconfig or ifconfig, if you have a Linux machine, basically it will give you an IP address internally that probably will fall in this range, right? So an IP address is made up of 4 octets. 1, 2, 3, 4. The range of the IP address goes from 0 to 255, right? So if you ever hear somebody say, oh, my IP address is 300 and whatever, you know that that's not a real IP address. From 0 to 255. Now, a real IP address won't start off with 0, you know, but the following octets can have 0 in it. Okay? So basically how IP addresses are used, they allow you to communicate with other people on the network. You know, you have a source and you have a destination. It's the same thing like when you send somebody mail, you have to put the source, which is your home address, and the destination, which is their address. So this is what IP addressing is dealing with. So at home, you'll have like a PC, right? And this PC, let's say, has this private IP address. Your PC is then connected to a home router, and your home router is then connected to the internet. And within the internet, or you could say behind the internet, you have servers. So a client-server network is basically a client is a host on a network that is requesting a resource, a web page, or whatever it may be. A server is a host on a network that is providing the resources. Okay? A server has an IP address. You know, let's say 23, 42. Let's make up some number or whatever to give it. Right? So what happens is when you type in a website, let's say google.com, this is what you call a domain name. It has to be translated into an IP address, a public IP address, right? So going back to this example, you have different classes of IP addresses. You have class A, B, C, and D. And basically what these different classes tell you is what portion of the IP address is the network portion and what portion of the IP address is the host portion. And just to show you an example, class A is from 1 to 126. Class B address is from 128 to 191. Class C is from 192 to 223. And then Class D address is from 224 to 255, which you see is the maximum amount. Now, what happens is each one of these classes has what you call a subnet mask. A subnet mask is a value of ones in an IP address that represent the host portion. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So when you look at one octet, right? Let's go back to this. There's 192. this 192 in decimal form and you convert it into binary form, it's represented by ones and zeros. You know, so for each one of these octets, if you was to add all these up, 8 bits equals 1 byte, you will have 32 bits. It's a 32-bit addressing scheme. So going back to the private IP addresses and public IP addresses, you have your router on this side of the network, you have your private network. On this side of the network, you have your public network. So what happens is when you type in what is my IP on Google, it's going to show you what the public IP address is of your router. It's not going to show you your private IP address, because when you actually go out to the internet, your private IP address gets NATed. NAT, Network Address Translation. So it's basically translating your private IP into a public IP that's routable to the internet. So when this server wants to communicate back to you, it's going to send it to your public NATed IP address, which gets appended on it once it hits your router. Okay? So going back to the different classes of IP addresses, class A, B, C, D, you can see that this IP address, 192.168.1.7, falls in the class C range. So as I mentioned before about a subnet mask is a flow of bits of ones that show what the host portion is of a network. So the subnet mask for a class A network, I'm running out of room, let's try to squeeze it right here, is 255.0.0.0. So what this basically saying is that the first octet in an IP address represents the network. If we look at this network, the first octet is 192, which falls in a class C. And if I go to a class C, class B is 255.255.0.0. C is 255.255.255.0. So a class C address is showing that the first 3 octets of the IP address is the network portion. So what this means is that on this home network, let's say we connect it like a mobile device or a phone. When it gets an IP address, the first 3 octets will be the same as this PC, 192.168.1, because this represents the network portion, because we know that this is a class C network, and because the subnet mask is 8, 16, 24 bits long, we will take the first 24 bits long of the IP address, and the last octet will represent the IP address of the device. On a network, no 2 devices can somewhat share the same IP address. Okay, so on this network, if this mobile device was to grab an IP address, it would use, let's say like the last octet would be like .8 or .9 or 10 or something like that, up to 255. Now let's talk about this 255. The 255 address is what some people is what's known as the broadcast address. This is the address that when you want to send something to all the hosts on the network, if you had a .7, 8, 10, 12, and a whole bunch of devices connected, it's the broadcast address. Let's talk about another address that normally ends in .1, which would be this internal interface, is what we call the gateway IP, right? So on your home router, the gateway IP is most likely 192.168.1.1. If you want to connect to your router's home IP address, you can type this in your URL in your browser, and it'll take you to the login page, and you just type in your username and password, and you can manage your router. The gateway IP address is the IP address that gets you out to the internet. So that was a lot on the internet protocol, but there is more to mention. But I think next I'll do an actual demonstration video on, the practical uses of an IP address and show you, I guess, some command line and some other tools that you can use that evolve around the IP address. But there you go. Internet Protocol IPv4.